cosmology or something, but it's about meaning.
Right. It's final causality, not efficient causality. And that's why it's hidden in Aquinas. It's not up front, like here are my 5 ways, but it's a hidden way. But it's actually closer in spirit to Aristotle himself, who thought the final cause was the most important. And so if you pursue final causality all the way, you come to some version of summum bonum, or what, Paul Tillich, the religious philosopher, talked about ultimate concern, right? Everyone has an ultimate concern. You do, everyone does. If you didn't, you wouldn't act in any way. And Tillich always said, and I follow this in my own pastoral life, the most important question to ask about any person is, what does that person worship? Once you know that, you'll know the rest of that person's life pretty well. It'll fall into coherence. What's your ultimate concern? And he defined religion famously as ultimate concern. So in that way, then you've got either true religion, that's Augustine, vera religio, or you just got regular religio. You've got some form of false religion or false worship.
Now, what do you make of people who say that on an atheistic picture of the universe, what we essentially are as human beings are highly evolved mammals that have slowly developed this accidental consciousness to help us to survive. And so the ultimate motivating factor behind all of our behaviors, even if it's subconscious, would be something just as simple as the drive to survive, the drive to reproduce. Because, of course, somebody's not likely to say this. Some people might reference their children, but on the cognitive level, we might reference having some belief in a set of ideals, but we might say that this is essentially a way that the brain tricks itself into being more likely to survive, because by having these invented ideals, it's more likely to do the work that's going to lead us to survive. And so maybe that's the fundamental value. And I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't characterize it as people worshipping their survival. It would be that this is the motivating factor, and what they're actually worshipping is some invented ideal that just helps to prolong their survival.
I know. I've never found that convincing. To me, that's just hopelessly reductionistic. I mean, to take Hamlet and say somehow I can reduce that to the survival instinct, or I can read Plato's Republic and say, well, that's finally all about the survival instinct or the Divine Comedy. To me, it's hopelessly reductionistic. Is something like bodily survival, basic instincts, ingredient probably in everything we do? Yes, I would say, because we have bodies, and the bodies have evolved from lower forms, and they have all of those instincts and impulses. I wouldn't deny that for a minute. I'm not a Platonist in that way. But I do think there's something that transcends the merely animal dimension of our life, and it's revealed in things like Hamlet and things like our ultimate concern and our quest, not just for a particular beautiful thing, but for the source of beauty. And that's that very interesting moment. It's James Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist, when he's that famous scene looking out at the woman who would eventually be his wife, and he describes her in this rapturous way. And when she turns to look at him, and then he says, "Oh, heavenly God." And that's the move from Plato through Dante up to James Joyce and many others, that through the particular beautiful thing, I'm triggered into an awareness of the source of beauty, the beauty that I'm seeking implicitly in every particular beautiful thing. Or, when you grasp a mathematical relationship and it's so powerful to you, and the truth of it is not just the evanescent truth of, well, that thing is in front of me right now. It's you've grasped something that's true in any possible world, that's true at any place or time. That triggers an awareness of the source of truth. So that's how I think it works in a religious consciousness. But I go back to Plato with that intuition.
It's interesting how you characterize the position as being reductionist. I share your intuition that something like Hamlet, the idea that the production of it could be reduced to apes trying to survive, seems incredible. But the two things I would say in response to that is, firstly, this is true of all evolutionary biology, in that I might talk about some minute facet of my body, like my eyelashes or something. And the idea that the development of these particular hairs on the end of an eyelid somehow serve in the great survival of species on planet Earth, it seems so absurd and disconnected. But actually, if you draw a long enough chain of reasoning as to why we ended up here, it can be explained in those terms. And also, you said a moment ago that all the behaviors that we participate in are motivated in some way, they're moral in some way, and there's some kind of ultimate motivation. And you said that you would call this God or ground it in God, meaning that, you know, if I choose to read a book or if I choose to get on a plane or go to the shop to buy some food, ultimately I'm being motivated by this religious structure. And in the same way that you say it seems absurd that Hamlet can be reduced to evolutionary biology, I might say, well, it seems absurd that me getting up and going to the shop and telling the guy to keep the change is inflatable to something like a religious structure. But I think you would say that although that seems a little strange upon first hearing, there is a chain there that does ultimately is ultimately fully explained by religion. In the same way, maybe something like Hamlet and the immense awe that human beings feel upon looking upon their loves or upon understanding the universality of mathematics is rather, you know, depressingly, but perhaps just a very long offshoot of this struggle for survival.
Well, let's play with it for a little bit. I mean, might you trace origins of these ideas back that way? Possibly. But the experience of the idea itself in its full expression, that's where I'm balking to say, well, I'm going to sort of thereby debunk it and say, well, it's really nothing but, now fill in the blank, you know. We're bodies. We come up from the earth and we come up from these deeper, you know, animal instincts and all that. I don't deny that. But I don't think you believe for a second that when you're entertaining some really high level mathematics, even though the ultimate origin we could trace even, you know, biologically backward, that in itself it's reducible to a mere concern for survival. That something's opened up there that transcends that dimension. And that, again, that's Plato escaping from the cave, that you've moved to a higher level of consciousness. I just balk at the reductionism because I think it mocks the truth of that experience. So bracket religion for a second, just aesthetic experiences or epistemic experiences or really profound moral experiences. You know, when you see someone like a Maximilian Kolbe, an act of extraordinary saintly heroism in the moral order, and you say, that's explicable in evolutionary terms. I mean, I just don't buy it. I think something has opened up that mocks that kind of reductionism.
I mean, it's
Explain
a strong intuition.
Kolbe. You know what I mean? Maximilian Kolbe, who gave his life in Auschwitz. He was not chosen by the Nazis. They chose 10 people at random to die because someone escaped from the barracks. Kolbe came forward because there was a man that got to his knees and said, I have a wife and children. And so Kolbe came forward and said, I'm a Catholic priest, take me. And so the Nazis happily took him and then starved him to death. So he's one of the great martyr saints of the 20th century. I would submit to you, it's impossible to explain that on simply like evolutionary grounds or some variation of the survival instinct. I mean, I think it mocks the moral splendor of that act. And I think there's something that's concomitant in the epistemic and the aesthetic order too.
I mean, do you think it's truly impossible? I mean, I understand that it's depressing and potentially insulting, as you suggest there with the term mocking, to reduce such an act of heroism to biological drives. But I think that people interested in this line of thought are essentially trying to explain a phenomena. They're saying we have this phenomena of these animals that decide to sacrifice themselves for each other, and somebody comes along and says, well, look, I mean, in the evolution of mankind, people share their genes. You know, if somebody is an adult, they might sacrifice themselves easily for their children on an evolutionary ground. It's so easy to see evolutionarily why it would be that a father would sacrifice himself for his children, especially if the father isn't going to have any more kids. On a purely survival of the genes approach, it's the most straightforward thing in the world to see why that would be the case. Similarly, you can see why it might happen for a brother or a cousin, and you can expand this to strangers who share some genetics in the human race.
See how you're stretching that so thin now. I mean, you're beginning with something, as you say, is somewhat credible, intelligible, but now you're stretching it to read someone like Kolbe, to understand his act of self-sacrifice that way. I just don't buy it. I mean, I get it. I've read the arguments that
Yeah.
but I just don't think it honors the integrity of what's happening there. You
But
know?
this is why I wanted to bring this up in this way, is to say that
Yeah.
that first step of saying, well, the father sacrifices himself for his son or his children, let's say, and somebody comes along and says, I think this can be explained in terms of the survival of genes. I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, you're mocking the sacrifice, or you're diminishing the sacrifice, or you're ruining the moral import of that sacrifice. I think all they're doing is explaining it. And so, be it we may be sort of stretching things a bit more thinly, but the terminology that you used of trying to explain such a sacrifice by reference to the survival of genes being first impossible. You say, I think it's just impossible to describe it in these terms, and second, that it mocks the moral sacrifice. If it doesn't do it in the first case of the father sacrificing himself for the children, why would it do it in the latter?
Because you've stretched that string so tight at that point. I mean, I think you've not honored that a quantum has been crossed. There's something new that's emerged within human experience that can't just be reduced to a physical impulse. It's on a spectrum, obviously, because I would say both visible and invisible, both body and soul, and there's elements that we can explain through recourse to material causality. But then others, I just think a quantum's been crossed. And I always just sort of laugh. That's why I use the Hamlet example, that it just seems so ludicrous to me to say that that's understandable utterly. I mean, maybe in certain respects or in the beginning of the analysis or something, but that utterly Hamlet's explicable in terms of evolutionary principles strikes me as ludicrous.
Hmm.
And the same with high moral acts like the Kolbe Act or, in any of the three basic orders.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you think it would be stretching an explanation thin, but I mean, as you say, you're familiar with. I mean, there's a wealth of literature and a wealth of generally scientists, I think, are of this view. When you hear people talking about reducing morality to evolutionary drives, it's often a scientist rather than a philosopher who's talking about it. But this is a view that's held, and it's a view that's quite popular, certainly among secular scientists and philosophers. I was just surprised to hear you so flatly describe it as impossible.
No, I didn't say impossible. I said the beginnings of the analysis might participate at that level, but I think a quantum is crossed at some point where that becomes ludicrously inadequate as an explanation. So I don't think you believe that. Whenever I talk to people or dialogue with people who are defending that position, I don't honestly think you believe that Hamlet or Maximilian Kolbe or the Sistine ceiling is utterly explicable in terms of evolutionary impulses. I don't think you believe that, because to me that's such a ludicrous position to hold. And it's animated, let's be honest, by a scientism. It's not animated by like pure objective science. It's by the assumption that reality must be reducible to the physical. So I'm going to make this finally ludicrous claim that these very high spiritual and moral values are purely explicable in terms of their evolutionary foundations. I mean, I think it's motivated by a philosophical prejudice much more than objective science.
I mean, certainly, I would hesitate to recommend that people assume that let's say a materialistic explanation ought always be favored. There's this idea, which I think is what you're describing as scientism here, that should there be a materialistic hypothesis, there should be some kind of bias or some kind of some kind of automatic leaning towards that explanation over a non-material explanation. I don't think we should do that. I think that explaining human action in terms of an ultimate sense of spirituality and belief in God is a powerful explanation. I also do think that explaining human action in terms of an evolutionary drive. So, for example, I've talked in a few podcasts now about this idea of terror management theory, which I don't know if you've come across, but it's the idea that human beings are ultimately motivated by a fear of their own death at the same time as a recognition of its own of the inevitability of their death. And so human beings are unique in the sense that all animals are going to die, but human beings seem unique in having a recognition of that mortality. And so when we ask, why is it that only human beings produce things like Hamlet? It may be because engaging in art like this is a way to escape death in the sense of having something of yourself that outlasts your physical death. Now, of course, this is a scientific hypothesis about how the brain works. It might be true, it might be false, but it seems at least plausible to me. It doesn't seem ludicrous and totally out of the question to suggest that the reason why people produce works like Hamlet, and indeed the reason why people engage in spiritual affairs like religion, the reason why people produce music, and the reason why if somebody finds out they're about to die, it might motivate them to finish that magnum
Yeah,
opus.
but that's again so reductionistic because that's all Shakespeare was doing. All he was concerned about was making sure that his reputation endures over the ages. I mean, maybe somewhere in his consciousness he was thinking about that, but I think what he was motivated by, if you ask me, is the sheer beauty and truth that he intuited and he wanted artistically to express in this sublime manner. I mean, I don't think he was in his room thinking, oh no, I gotta make sure my reputation. I mean, who cares finally? If I'm going to die like an animal, go to the ground, I don't care if anyone remembers me. Why would I? So to me, that's so implausible. I think Shakespeare was a genius who, like all geniuses, intuited values at a very high level and wanted to express that because it was lovely so to do. You know, and I'm just balking at this, finally, to me, very scientific prejudice that says, oh, no, that can't be right. I don't think Shakespeare worried that much about his stupid reputation. Do you, honestly?
Well, to be clear, I don't think that I don't think that the alternative that you're providing here is silly or should be thrown out. I'm just presenting an alternative here, and of course, Shakespeare isn't consciously thinking of these things. This is what terror management theory is all about: is that we essentially have a subconscious drive towards doing things which allow us to outlive ourselves. It's why human beings have an obsession with doing things that are larger than themselves because of the fact that, as you say, if you know you're just an animal and you're just going to die,
who cares?
you know, life becomes purposeless and nihilistic. But purposelessness and nihilism are very uncomfortable positions to hold, and that's why human beings invent these ways to try to outlive themselves, because of the fact that they recognize that they're going to die one day, and
I don't buy
that will be the end of it. I mean,
No,
for example,
I'll tell you why I don't buy it, because you're such a smart guy and that you've had that experience of intuiting great value. You know what that's like. What a sublime moment that is. And it's something beyond simply physical survival or beyond physical preoccupations, and appeal to unconscious all you want, but you know what that's like when you've grasped a truth or something beautiful or splendid or transcendently good. It's more than just the body going on there, you know. So I'm trying to speak out of, I think, the mainstream of the Western philosophical tradition, and resisting a materialistic reductionism. You know what reminds me of, Alex, very much is Hobbesian political philosophy versus Aristotelian. So Hobbes is one of the masters of this approach of, well, you know, human beings are just motivated by fear of violent death. And so all the things that we invent about the moral purpose of government and what makes a state just, forget it. All states are there is to protect us from each other. You know, that we're animals toward each other, so life is nasty, brutish, and short, and so we need the Leviathan state to come in and organize things. And Hobbes felt he was thereby producing a political science, as opposed to all this airy-fairy political philosophy that came before him. But I'm with Aristotle. You know, I'm against that sort of materialistic reductionism. There's something splendid about politics, I think. There's something of great moral value about it that Aristotle and Aquinas and all those great figures saw. And Hobbes, I think, was a father in many ways of the position that not that you're defending it yourself personally, but you're presenting it. And I just feel the need to stand athwart that position.
I wonder what you think. Suppose Shakespeare were to find out, you know, he's writing his latest play, and he finds out secretly that, you know, 2 years after he dies, just after he dies, the entire world is going to be destroyed by some meteorite or something. Every single human being is just going to die. Do you think this would have the effect of motivating him to write as much as he can? Or do you think this would have the effect of saying, well, then there's no point? Because to me, I don't know about Shakespeare, but for many people, I think that, you know, if I found out that the world was going to end in a week or just after I die or something, my motivation to produce these podcasts would completely collapse, because I would feel like there's intuitively no point in doing so. But that says to me that at least part of the motivation for what I'm doing here is that there's something that is going to, outlast me, and I'm not just doing it for its own sake of being intrinsically worthwhile, but because I know that if it were the case that it was all going to come to nothing very, very shortly, I wouldn't be as motivated. That says to me that it does have perhaps more to do with what I'm suggesting than with what you're suggesting.
Well, but it is all going to come to an end. I mean, whether it's tomorrow or next week or in billions of years, it will. I mean, Michelangelo's David will be nothing. Shakespeare's Hamlet will disappear. Nothing will last forever. Of course, I know that. Every artist and every philosopher knows that. In a way, who cares? I think you do it because it's good so to do. And in fact, it links you to a transcendent realm. So I would flip it around, that you discover the transcendent precisely through these breakthroughs, these epiphanies. There's Joyce again, right? His job as a writer was to report epiphanies. He said, beautiful, even though he repudiated the church, which he did, but he was inescapably Catholic, James Joyce, because that's a deeply Catholic instinct. He wanted to be a priest for a time, but he became indeed a priest, but of a literary order, because he now was a minister of epiphanies, and his artistry was meant to display them, and when you do that, I would say authentically, you're in touch with a transcendent value that will transcend the world, that does indeed exist at a higher level than the world. So in a way, who cares how long the world survives or not? You do it because it's splendid so to do. That's why Kolbe, gave up his life for someone he barely knew this man, but gave his life to him, for him. I think those are what values are like, and that's where meaning comes from.
I want to shift gears based on something that we were just talking about, which is death and death's inevitability. Is it possible for a Christian who believes that there is life after death to see human death as a tragedy?
Well, not ultimately. I mean, I think we can see it as a tragedy within the framework of this world, but we hold to a divine comedy. I mean, we hold to an ultimate purpose to the world and to creation. So death, we would tend to intuit as a doorway to a higher type of consciousness, a higher realm of experience. So it depends on how you define tragedy, I suppose.